Socrates says the unexamined life is not worth living, but the examined life ain't no picnic either. A happy, happy, joy, joy, click your heels kind of happiness doesn't look to be a dominant sort of model for what I think is the more important concept, which is something like a meaningful life. Once you made above $100,000 American, more money gets you more things, but it doesn't increase your happiness. Anyone, were he to see the child falling into the well, would immediately feel alarm and compassion. In a chapter called Human Nature is Bad, says, Mencius is wrong. Two extreme answers would be, one is we're devils, and we're angels. And what the Dalai Lama said, kill Hitler because you're stopping a bad karmic chain. Not be angry with him or hate him. You should love him and have compassion for him. Bad genes, bad environment. He's better off dead, but it's sorrowful. There might be empirical questions like, which gets the child to behave the best quickly? Might well be that the Japanese technique is better. If you ignore a behavior, it goes away more quickly than if you punish it.
This is the conversation with Owen Flanagan. He's the James B. Duke Distinguished Professor of Philosophy and Neurobiology at Duke University and the Visiting Professor at NYU Abu Dhabi. He's the author of the books The Geography of Morals, The Bodhisattva's Brain, The Really Hard Problem, The Science of the Mind, to name a few, and is consistently one of the leading philosophers out there. In this conversation, we talk about happiness, whether the pursuit of happiness is actually an ideal goal in life, whether countries should actually aim to make the citizens happy, what happiness means across different cultures. We talk about the happiness agenda. We talk about his journey into philosophy and his religious upbringing, how that influence has shaped his philosophy in life. We then cover the geography of morals. Are people born with a sense of morality? Are people inherently good or evil or neutral? Or do you cultivate that over time? Do you learn that from other people or from society? We also cover moral nihilism. We also cover anger. The philosophy of anger. Is anger a bad emotion, which is something the Buddhists might believe? Or is anger a good emotion, a useful emotion? Is it neutral? In general, we also cover the philosophy of emotions. I'm a geek for conversations like these. I live and die for these conversations. But 2-hour discussions about philosophy or about metaphysics or about the philosophy of anger, morality, and ethics is not something the algorithm pushes. Trust me, I would know because I've seen this happen with my previous videos. So if you think these conversations are of value, and I firmly believe they are, and I think people have an appetite for these, then please consider sharing them around. I'll tell you how by the end of the video, but you only have to do it if you found this conversation useful and worth your time.
And now, mademoiselle, it's no time.
Check the mic and make sure it sound right, boys.
In the movie Annie Hall, Woody Allen approaches a couple and he asks them, you look like a very happy couple. How do you do it? And then they say, we are very shallow and empty. We have no ideas and nothing interesting to say. And then Woody Allen says, oh, looks like you worked out something for yourself. Now, when I watched that movie, I thought, oh, Woody Allen has solved the mystery of happiness. But since I have you here today, I just want a second opinion. You've studied happiness for so many decades. You've studied the origins of happiness. You've studied what happiness means across cultures and in different schools of thought, Aristotle's idea of happiness, flourishing, or the Buddhist philosophy. You also critiqued the happiness agenda in your book Against Happiness. So, has Woody Allen cracked the mystery of happiness? And first, we'll start with the individual level, then we'll move on to nations. Or should I just take one step back and just ask myself, is this even the right question? Is happiness something I should aim for? Is that the ultimate goal for a good life?
I love that scene in Annie Hall also, and I always bring it up. And I actually hadn't, I remember it, part of it, but I didn't remember exactly the words as you put them. I remember the couple is happy in virtue of the fact that nothing crosses their mind whatsoever. And it reminds me, there was Socrates says the unexamined life is not worth living. And of course, and we get that in sort of Socratic dialogue. Socrates is always like wondering and worrying. And I remember in the movie Annie Hall, when Woody and Diane Keaton are having one of their first dates, there's always thought bubbles above them, and then there are thought bubbles above the thought bubbles, and meta thought bubbles and meta thought bubbles, and which produces a kind of anxiety, of course. You might think, on the one hand, of course, we do think or someone like me thinks, who's sort of a New York intellectual of a certain period. That's just the nature of the beast, to just be a kind of highly reflective person and just up the ante and keep going higher and higher and examining. I think it was Sidney Morgenbesser, an old Columbia professor now long deceased. He said, well, Socrates says the unexamined life is not worth living, but the examined life ain't no picnic either. And so it's a generally interesting question about, and it comes up, we see the same question, Solange, in John Stuart Mill says this. He says, and it relates exactly to the Annie Hall scene. He says, most humans would rather be Socrates dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Okay, so that's kind of an interesting reflection on exactly that moment, right? Where we have sort of would I rather be someone who's just kind of immune to the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, just because I wake up on the side of the bed that sees everything brightly and I'm a Pollyanna of some sort and everything just always looks okay to me because I'm just not paying attention. There's something to be said for that kind of childish way of being, as it were, satisfied and happy in the world. But then again, it does seem like there's losses to that. Namely, one is not sort of focused on the ways that the world does present difficulties, the way there is suffering in the world. Likely there is suffering in one's own life. So, but it's probably all of us do sometimes fantasize and hope that we just would stop thinking about something that's painful, and we almost wish it could go missing because it would just feel better to ourselves. Yeah, so in terms of the sort of overall topic of happiness, you're right. I've been wondering and thinking about it for most of my life, although I wouldn't say it's it's a topic I keep coming back to because I am very, very curious about the role of happiness and even what it means in individual lives. So, for example, there's a lot of good research by a psychologist named Jeannie Tsai, where she looks at the top 10 children's books sold in different countries on Amazon. And by the way, children's books are bought by grandparents primarily, which is kind of interesting. And what Jeannie does is she looks at the emotions or the emotional states that are advocated for in the children's books. And what she finds is that if you look at North American children's books, they advocate for what she calls high arousal positive, HAP, the HAP face, which is kind of that big, great, when you're asked to say how happy you are with your banker today, you get to press 1 to 10. The frown, and it's that basically that ridiculous like grin that takes up the whole face. And it might be the very face of the couple that Woody Allen and Diane Keaton meet up with. They're just happy as a clam. And she sees that advocated for in American children's books. She sees in children's books in Taiwan, Taipei, Taiwan, Hong Kong, certain places in India she studies also. I forget where. It's not international yet. But what she finds is that they advocate for what she calls a low arousal positive face. Now, we might call it a happy face, but the likely thing that we would call it is something like a serene or contented face. So first thing out of the gate in terms of thinking about happiness is what sort of conception do we have of happiness? On the one side, you could have a kind of conception which is like the happy, happy, joy, joy, click your heels kind of happiness, that when your team wins a football match, that lasts a little bit. It's a great feeling. It's a wonderful feeling. But nothing existentially, ultimately that weighty dependent upon the outcome of that game, although it could seem like it. Or is it something more like a settled feeling of contentment and satisfaction in one's life? So I've been quite interested in the fact that there's, first of all, cross-cultural disagreement about what the state looks like. And it ranges roughly from what I just said to states which are more serene and contented. However, there are some places, cultures, in which when people think about happiness, they think it's just not a good at all. And I get the point of them. So let me give 2 examples. I happen to be teaching about this week. We read an old paper, well, not that old, it's 21st century paper, but at the beginning of the 21st century, about the women in a temple town in Bengali part of India, Orissa. And basically what the anthropologist, Menon is her name, she's in Philadelphia, studied was that these families are patrilineal, women marry into the husband's family, and patrilocal, they live where the husband lived, arranged marriages, households of 15 to 20 people on average. And when they studied the woman's conception of what is a good or a meaningful or a happy life, she was focused on happiness primarily. Essentially, the woman, almost universally, the woman thought that good human lives did not focus at all on happiness, that was a state that they called happy, I forget the word in their language, was for little girls, because that was the only period of life where you had no responsibilities. And it was little girl specific. Actually, it's quite interesting in this anthropological piece. Little boys would never even have access to this state of little girl happiness because they did have to do work for the family.
There was some responsibility.
They had some responsibility, so they wouldn't actually experience it. Whereas the girls had this sort of free period of time in their family of origin where they could just literally sort of play and have no cares or worries. But they thought that that was wonderful, that the girls had it, but not to be taken seriously about living a good human life. That a good human life involved carrying out the roles and responsibilities and obligations that came with being first a junior wife, then a middle wife, and then a mother-in-law wife, and then so on and so forth. That was one example. Another interesting example was in a paper by my dear colleague and friend David Wong, who's a philosopher at Duke University with me, works in Chinese philosophy. And David tells a story about his mom, who had been born in China. They came to America, and they were he was born in Minnesota. And so there's a conflict. His mother basically confronts his teenage self and says, I don't get what you and your friends are on about, this thing called happiness. I think it's just not a serious value. What's a serious value is doing your roles and responsibilities again. So I think it's a very interesting question. I mean, clearly it would be heretical to say to my fellow Americans that we don't care, that happiness isn't as important as we think. Although actually I'm willing to say happiness isn't as important as we think, at least from the point of view of other cultures. The happy, happy, joy, joy, click your heels kind of happiness doesn't look to be a dominant sort of model for what I think is the more important concept, which is something like a meaningful life or a flourishing life. It's clear that happiness, like of some sort or other, it's better to have a life in which hedonically you're feeling good as opposed to hedonically feeling bad, all else equal. I think that's fair to say. But there have been many great successful lives if we think about, people like Martin Luther King Jr. We even think about great sages. Was Jesus happy? Not clear. Was Socrates happy? Not clear. Confucius happy? Wasn't unhappy, but Buddha? Unclear. So I think it's an interesting question. Let's put it this way. I don't think it's obvious that happiness at the individual level is the most important thing, but it's a good thing.
You've explored this in your book, The Bodhisattva Brain, where you've, in a way, compared and contrasted Aristotle's approach to a flourishing life, which maybe I might be summarizing this wrong, but it's slightly more external, outward looking. If you are friendly, if you are generous with people, it depends on your actions, relationships, with the Buddhist philosophy of a flourishing life, which was slightly more contemplative, serene. It's more inward looking, have no anger in your life. And I find this very, very fascinating. Also, Ralph Waldo Emerson agrees with that, at least that stance, which says that the purpose of a life is not to be happy. He had said it is to be useful, to be honorable, to be compassionate, and to make some difference. And that's the definition of a life that's lived well. Okay, that was on an individual level, but I also want to bring in nation states, the progress of nations. This is something you've explored in your book, Against Happiness, which you co-author with Joseph Ledoux, who's also been on the show. And another guest who's been on the show, Jeffrey Sachs, is probably on the other end.
That's right.
He's a critic of economic policy, and he says that often GDP doesn't account for the well-being of citizens or the happiness or the quality of life. And as a result, they need to countries need to implement some form of a happiness metric. So Bhutan did this. They implemented the gross national happiness. And they said this is as equal or maybe even more equal than the gross domestic product. But now this opens up a new can of worms because Bhutan describes happiness as a collective state, as a communal state. No one person can be happy if the entire community is miserable. Whereas the American view might be slightly more individualistic. So is it even the right approach to implement happiness metrics when it comes to economic policy for a nation? And will we ever have a universal consensus of what's happiness?
Good. Yeah, I love this topic. Yeah, so I'm a fan of. I use that word that comes from Aristotle. Aristotle, just to start with the first part of your thread, and then we'll get right to these universal metrics for happiness or well-being. So you're totally right. I mean, again, just like with the, say, Jeannie Tsai work on children's books and which kind of picture of happiness is modeled, different models, so too, Aristotle says a human life, a life of eudaimonia, eu meaning good, daimon meaning spirit, a life of good spiritedness. When I was in graduate school in the early 1970s, all of a sudden, we used to translate that word in Aristotle, eudaimonia, Greek word, as happiness. But then a professor at Princeton named John Cooper all of a sudden announced to the world, that's naughty, don't do that anymore, use the word flourishing. Which is interesting because it was already, what Cooper was seeing was that there's a kind of the couple in Annie Hall concept of happiness. Yeah. And that was maybe helping people misinterpret what Aristotle was up to. So Aristotle is very clear that, a good human life, a life of eudaimonia, is an active life of developing your talents, your interests, your capacities, your abilities, and your virtue. So becoming a morally, and we might say, well-rounded person. And it's an active life out there in the world doing that. The Buddhist view of happiness, some people say that even though the Dalai Lama, for example, wrote a book with Howard Cutler called The Art of Happiness, I think it was called, that traditional Buddhism actually doesn't promise happiness at all. It thinks of happiness as an illusion. What it promises is mitigation of suffering, which is a different thing. So there's been even controversy inside Buddhist circles about that. But insofar as Buddhism does have a concept of sort of positive well-being, of something in the vicinity of happiness, it does look somewhat different both psychologically and practically from the active Aristotelian life. So again, you see the cultural differences. So with respect to your excellent question about the project, so what happened, the history here is kind of interesting, like how Joe Ledoux and I, and Batya Mesquita and the other authors developed this against happiness sort of motto. Not that we're against happiness truly, but we were worried about the following. So let me give a little background here that might be helpful. So I'm good friends with Jeff Sachs, and Jeff Sachs had invited me in to be part of meetings at the Vatican. The first set of meetings over a 3-year period were every 3 months over a 3-year period were on the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, which do focus on well-being. In other words, they're focused, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations are things like equal education for all the boys and the girls of the earth through high school, gender justice, peace, climate justice, for example. So things that would be conducive to overall well-being of a population. After we finished that project among sort of religious leaders and secular people like myself, we started up a new project on, I think we called it Science, Ethics, and Wellbeing. And it was, again, religious leaders from across the world and a lot of the principles in the World Happiness Report, which Jeff has been one of the leaders for years. And as you say, the World Happiness Report has been measuring happiness, what they call happiness. Maybe they're in the 10th or 12th report by now, I think. And I was at the first meeting where the ministers from Bhutan were at Columbia University. And as you say, what happened there was that Bhutan, the tiny little country of Bhutan, surrounded by China and India, some people were criticizing Bhutan for having a low gross domestic product. And the king at the time said, well, gross domestic happiness is more important than money. And at the same time, some economists were making the discovery that once you made above, we'll say it's probably now about $100,000 American for a family of four, then more money gets you more things, but it doesn't increase by most measures of happiness, your happiness.
This is the Easterlin paradox.
The Easterlin paradox is called. Now, what's interesting about that is that was treated very much as a discovery in economics. But what's funny about it is if you look at every great world spiritual and philosophical tradition, the theme that money doesn't bring happiness is there from the very beginning. So it interests me as a scholar always to see how sometimes people need some contemporary social scientists to discover something which has been known for a long time. But in any case, that led then to a industry of many, many different measures of happiness. And the main measure of happiness that's used in the World Happiness Report, the main measure, it's not the only measure, is a measure which asks people, how satisfied are your life? How satisfied are you with the life you're living on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 to 11, with the worst life being sort of complete dystopia and the best life being complete utopia? And then what you do is you gather the populational results from that, and then countries are ranked. And so what you reliably do find is that Scandinavian countries have the highest. I think Finland has been up there number one for the last 3 or 4. You'll find places like the United States around the 20s. Dubai has been trying to be the happiest city in the world. And I was in some consultations with people from Dubai about this. The criticism that me and my colleagues had was not necessarily with doing this kind of social scientific measure. You're not going to stop these things. But it was trying to call attention to some of the concerns about these measures, because within the community which studies happiness and well-being, there are controversies. So here's a couple of the controversies. One is that we know, just take America, if you go to some of the poorest cities in America, certain parts, East St. Louis, Missouri, for example, or certain parts of Atlanta, Georgia, that are the poorest Black communities, you find reliably there that the single Black men, most of whom have lost their wives and their families, will reliably give measures to their life that are 7 or above. That's about what Finland's scales are. So you'll get peculiar results in those cases. And if you ask those people where they think, those men who are poor and living miserable lives typically, where they think they'll be in a few years, they think they'll be 10. And no one says that in the world. So you have these odd kind of cohort effects, which are where people just seem to say sort of odd things. We also know that, for example, in order to rank Japan, we'll just take Japan, you have to add a point to Japan and deduct a point from Americans. Exaggerate, Japanese underestimate.
Understated, yeah.
So that's one thing. But those are two things. A third problem that we're very interested in is that the report itself isn't attentive enough to is the Gini coefficient, as you know, in economics, measures inequality in a country. And the World Happiness Report in studying objective well-being can sometimes mask that. And here's what I have in mind. If there's a country in which 30% of the people are super duper rich and 70% are super duper poor, the average might be actually relatively high. It might look relatively good, but it could really be bimodal. And most theories of justice say, don't look at the average of the happiness, look at things like the Gini coefficient and look at the worst off. So sometimes we think that these happiness measures can mask inequalities that are important to look at. The third question is this. Aristotle is almost always, third criticism, Aristotle is almost always mentioned as in favor of doing something like the World Happiness Report. The authors always say, Aristotle would love this. Aristotle believes that eudaimonia is measured by a person's satisfaction with her own life. But actually, Aristotle is quite explicit that he thinks that that's not the way to measure it. It's actually an objective matter whether a person has satisfied or achieved her potential, either moral or otherwise. So the fact that a person is satisfied with her life, unless they've actually achieved their potential objectively, now how we measure that is complicated, or become a morally excellent person, that's what whether they're flourishing depends on. And it's not a subjective judgment for Aristotle. So we don't have, and there are some tests out there that measure these different things. So basically our critique is of the World Happiness Report and measures like that only look at subjective happiness. And a lot of the happiness industry in general, for example, I have been at various business schools talking. They always have programs about happiness and leadership and things like that, like Arthur Brooks at Harvard has one. And they focus on the sort of serenity and well-being of particular individuals, doing yoga and breathing and mindfulness exercise. It's kind of just sort of psychological hygiene for people who already admire their own selves and their own lives. And I think there's something, sort of peculiar about it. And that takes me back finally to what you said about Bhutan, because, Bhutan, the leaders of Bhutan have said, no one is happy unless everyone is happy. Well, that just should mean that regularly Bhutanese should say, well, I'm not happy yet.
Right.
And there's something to be said for that conception, because surely if happiness is a good thing, then we should want everybody to have it.
Amartya Sen is also in this group of critics, and he had said, you might find someone who's a starving wreck, buffeted by disease, and probably ravished by a famine, but if their mental state has been enhanced by what he called the opium of religion, then the happiness metric would actually rank high for someone like that. Okay, fascinating questions. While we're talking about what makes for a flourishing life, what do you want to devote your life to, I want to take a quick digression and talk about your personal journey, what you decided to devote your life to, which is philosophy. You grew up in Westchester County in an Irish Catholic family, and you were the eldest of 6. And you've said in the past that you grew up in a religious environment, borderline superstitious environment. You went to a Catholic school, you were raised by nuns. And around the age of 13, you started to question things around you, this belief system around you. So your father sensed this. He gave you a Summa Theologica by Thomas Aquinas. Yep. And you've said that book started your journey in philosophy because it got you to start thinking like a philosopher.
Yeah.
So I want to jump back in time and talk not just about the book, but about philosophy in general. What was philosophy? What did it mean to you? What was so attractive about it that you decided, this is what I want to do for the rest of my life?
Yeah. Well, good. And you really have read up on me. So thank you for that, reminding me. Yeah. So I was good questions. And I think what philosophy turned out to be was not exactly what I thought, which isn't surprising because you're a little kid at one point. You don't know what things are. But I do.
What did you think it was going to be?
Well, right. So when I was a little boy, I was, and here I would say to this day, and I have more than one philosopher friend who's like me in this regard. They think that if it were not for them being brought up in such a religious household, they wouldn't have moved over to sort of secular philosophy. And the reason is this. So I think that I was very much my family of origin. I had a wonderful, healthy family. My father was the first person in our family to go to college, and he only went there because he fought in the Second World War, and there was the GI Bill that allowed men like him to go to college. And so what happened there was that you're exactly right. I mean, I was often caught up in religious rites and ceremonies. I was an altar boy serving priests, at masses. As a young boy, I was learning Latin, a very mysterious language, in order to do the masses with the priests. And I was exposed early on, maybe I was more inquisitive than others, to know that there were supposedly the bread and wine were turned into the body and blood of Jesus Christ. Now, if that isn't something that's hard to understand for a 5-year-old, I don't know what is. I was also taught a lot about sin and about Judgment Day. So I knew that being ethical was being moral by the lights of the Roman Catholic Church of my upbringing was going to be key to my salvation. And but I was also very disturbed by the ideas of hell. I wondered how a good God could do things like send people to hell. And so I was in, I guess, what I would call, maybe not unusual. I was in kind of both being raised religiously and in a lot of religious confusion. I didn't quite know how to put this all together and make sense of the whole thing. And so by the time I was 13, I guess it's not uncommon among my friends, puberty begins. And instead of going to 10 o'clock church, mass, we would start to go to 10 o'clock diner. That's where we would cut out from church and then go to the diner and drink, have pancakes and drink coffee and do adult things. And my father sort of, I was the first, and he saw that I was quietly yielding my religious belief. And I thought he took quite a brilliant approach. He gave me the abridged version, I should say, of the Summa Theologica. And he said, here are some proofs of the existence of God in here, and you should read them. You'd be interested. He didn't actually do it in any way punitive. In fact, I only suspected that he was giving it to me because he kind of knew what was going on in my mind. But I did read them religiously, you might say, in the abridged version, all 5 of Aquinas' arguments for the existence of God. I thought them all interesting. A few of them, of course, I was aware of because people often use, first cause or cosmological arguments, existence of God across traditions. So I was well aware that was out there. The design argument I hadn't really thought about before. But anyway, right away I thought, this is cool. This is very, very cool that you can think and write about these questions. And actually, it made me appreciate a side of Catholicism which I didn't quite know about, namely the intellectual side of Catholicism.
And you can reach there using reason and logic as well.
That reason and logic would get you to the same places. Exactly. So, and I was a good math student, things like that. So a lot of the logic seemed to come easily to me. I was familiar with the concepts. I thought, here's a guy who people think is one of the greatest thinkers in the history of Roman Catholic Church, and he's writing very clearly. Well, I was reading it in English, of course. But the point is, so I was kind of thrilled by this exercise. And I did feel in my high school, which was a Catholic boys' high school, after I finished with the nuns for 8 years, I went to a high school with 1,800 boys, Catholic boys. We didn't have priests as our teachers, a few priests, but mostly not priests, just what we called lay people in those days. We took religion. We took a lot of English literature. It was a broad liberal arts kind of education, I would say. So I was aware that the questions I was interested in philosophy were ones you could also think about in religion courses or history courses sometimes or in literature courses. But I also knew that there was this thing called philosophy, which was coming next up when I went to college. And so I went to college at a Jesuit university in New York, Fordham University.
Yeah.
This was always going to be my trajectory. Kids like me, there was never, we were told in my high school, we go to Boston College, Georgetown, or Fordham. We, people like us. It was just interesting. We didn't go to Ivy League schools. We weren't welcome there. We felt like we thought we weren't welcome there at that time. Of course, this is the early 1960s. And I was just telling someone the other day, in fact, just one quick thing that isn't quite on the philosophy part. When I got to high school in 1962, we met with a priest to discuss what language we would study. And he explained, those of you who are interested in science, you've got to pick between German and Russian because we don't know which is going to win as the language of science, but it's going to be English, German, or Russian. And 1957 was Sputnik, so you can see why the thought was there. Russians were leading the space race. Germans had the history of great scientific thought. Many of them had come to America. No one knew at the time. So that was just an interesting fact. But in any case, by the time I got to college in 1966, I took my first philosophy class. On the first day of class, this great big tall man said, those were the days when a syllabus was like this. You write on the board, this semester we'll read Kant, Nietzsche, Plato, Aristotle. And then he said these words. He said, Plato posits the good. And I thought, I don't know what posit means. I think I might get an idea. The word the definite article in front of good, I have no idea what that means. I like this a lot.
And good is capitalized.
Yeah, good is capitalized. And I said, I'm going to study this. Yeah, and I really did feel like that it was so far away from me, but it was something that drew me to it. So I just loved philosophy. Right from that first minute, I loved reading philosophy. I loved thinking philosophically. I loved doing philosophy. My daughter always says, Dad, I wish I had a passion like you that, you carry through on. But I do say to a certain extent, I said, I was good in school and I'm still there. That's sort of what happened.
Do you think you have to be born with this natural affinity for a particular subject? To use Aristotle's language, does it have to be in your first nature? Or is it the environment you grew up in, the books you read, the people you're surrounded with, that your second nature builds up your love for subject?
Well, it's a great question. And I think about this. I mean, when I read something like that there's a 12-year-old who's going to Juilliard or to Caltech or to MIT, it does make me think that some people just have this head starts. The equipment is up and running in a certain direction. And in some people, I guess I don't. I think that for philosophy, it almost always helps. I feel bad for students sometimes because sometimes students love philosophy, but they're not good in logic. And they don't usually make it well. They don't do well in philosophy afterwards if they're not good at logic.
You need logic?
What's weird about it, it isn't that you need logic in everyday life of being a philosopher. But if you don't have logic, it just usually shows up somewhere sooner or later as a weakness in your philosophical talents.
It caps your progress.
I think that's a good way to put it. It caps your progress. But I think you have to have a certain kind of curiosity about certain kinds of questions which are fundamentally philosophical. I mean, I'll give you an example. There is one question that I personally just never grabbed me philosophically, and that's external world skepticism. People who think that, there's tables and chairs and wonder about the reality of tables and chairs and things like that. And I think, well, you could talk about that for a while if you want to. I mean, that's fun. But some of the best philosophers I know take every single philosophical problem, including that, seriously. And, sometimes if you say to the students on the first day of a philosophy class, we wonder about things like, why is there something rather than nothing? Why is there anything at all? There are a few people whose eyes will glaze over, and they're very brilliant sometimes. They just are not interested in that question. They're not quite like the couple in the Annie Hall movie. It isn't that they think it's a stupid question entirely. It's just not going to get them interested.
And there might be someone else who just finds this question.
Finds it fascinating.
Spend your entire life just searching for this question.
Yeah. So I don't think that probably philosophical talent, it's interesting. We like to brag sometimes in philosophy. We say, the students come in and they say, my parents don't want me to major in philosophy because there's no money in philosophy. We say, well, actually, philosophers do really well on standardized tests, but we don't know whether we select for people who are antecedently good and going to be good in those things, or whether we produce people who then become good in those things. I suspect it's enough of a mix to wash out.
Yeah, that's such interesting questions. Early in your career, you were interested in psychology and the philosophy of the mind-body problem, consciousness. And then you said through sheer serendipity, you bumped into a group of moral psychologists and started getting interested in morality, the philosophy of ethics. So today I want to explore this geography of the moral landscape, travel on it with you today. And I want to compare and contrast some of the different theories that exist out there that talk about the development of morality in human beings. So first, I want to talk about Mencius and the sprout theory. And maybe we can introduce it with the help of a thought experiment. So let's say I'm walking outside one day, come across a well, and I see a child in a well. If I feel any compassion in that moment, is it because I was born with a seed for compassion or sprout that I have to cultivate later in my life? Or is this a trait that I've acquired because of the societal benefits? Because maybe my reputation will improve, his parents might give me a lot of respect, people will look upon me favorably. So formally, what is the sprout theory? And then do you agree with Mencius that human beings are inherently good, the human nature is inherently good? Or do you disagree with this premise?
Good. I'll start out by giving the answer, but then we go into it more deeply. So, yeah, you're right. One of the really interesting discussions across all cultures in both ethics and political theory has to do with the question of what I call, what are we like deep down inside beneath the clothes of culture?
Right.
If anything. I mean, and that's back to what you referred to earlier as the first nature question of Aristotle. What are we like? Now, and, two extreme answers would be, one is we're devils, and we're angels. Okay, those are on two sides. And then there are various admixture theories. So I think some form of admixture theory is probably right. Now, what are our innate dispositions? So here's the passage that you were talking about in Mencius, the great early Confucian philosopher. He says this: anyone, were he to see the child falling into the well, would immediately feel alarm and compassion. Not because he wanted to get good with the child's parents, not because he wanted to appear in the headlines of the local newspaper, not because he wanted to receive a monetary reward, just because that's the normal human response to a child falling into a well. Yeah. So what Mencius is clearly trying to do, and that's the first sprout, that is and the reason it's called sprout theory, for reasons you already indicated, is I sometimes say, like, imagine you want to make a garden and you go to the store where they sell the little, pouches with seeds in them. And you say, what will grow here is I want to grow tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, and squash. So you get the seeds might look alike for all you know, but you separate them out and then you grow 4 different things. So there's seeds for 4 plants. Your garden consists then of 4 plants, if you're lucky, if it gets the sun. So the sprout idea is roughly that one of the sprouts you have is this famous one in 2a6, the sprout of compassion. Now, and then there's some other ones. Another sprout is the sprout of propriety. That's where you have a sense of like how you're supposed to learn manners and things like that.
Deference, respect.
Yeah. Or another one would be knowing the difference between right or wrong. Most parents, at least when I was growing up, would say to the children, Owen, you know the difference. You know that it was wrong to hit your sister, or to take the Legos from your sister. What Mencius seems to think, and the best evidence he gives, I think, is for this sprout of compassion. And notice it's towards little children. It's an interesting question whether he said, you're walking along and you see an old person about to fall into a well. And he doesn't use that example. I mean, I think most of us would say you'd probably feel alarm and compassion. You'd feel alarm because it's a weird thing happening. And presumably you'd feel compassion. I mean, it'd be a weird person that didn't. But notice his claim is supposed to govern even, say, Adolf Hitler and a Jewish infant. I mean, seriously, even Hitler is supposed to be wired, according to this story, to feel alarm and compassion about a child. He just might be able to stop himself if he had more information and let the child fall in. So even people with policies to exterminate certain children or commit genocide would still be wired, according to Mencius.
The first nature is compassion, but then something else cuts it
is able to cut it out, feed it somehow.
Okay.
So the mentioned view then of, and especially as it was taken up inside Chinese political philosophy, is basically we have in humans the beginnings of goodness. And all we have to do is, but the same thing occurs as in the garden, we have to put the kids out in the sun and water them. It's very similar to Aristotle's views about socialization and habituation for virtue. The world has to be, first nature is not going to be enough. If we only just have compassion towards children falling into wells, that's just not going to be helpful. So we're going to have to build it up. But the sprouts allow us to build this. And that's contrasted in the Chinese case by the next philosopher who comes along in China named Xunzi, Xunzi. And he disagrees with Mencius, and he says, no, it isn't quite like Hobbes in chapter 13 of Leviathan, where Hobbes says, basically, we all want what we want for ourselves, but we realize we're not going to get what we want for ourselves unless we cooperate with other people, so we shake hands and decide to make a social contract. But Xunzi, in a chapter called Human Nature is Bad, says, Mencius is wrong, and human nature is minimally very disorderly. And what we need to do, in fact, he uses an example long before Kant talks about the crooked wood of humanity. Mencius actually is the first one to use that. He says you have to hone wood to make a wheel out of it. You have to really, and that's what you have to do with people. You have to really forcefully construct them in order to get orderly behavior out of us.
You've taken a quote from Xunzi, I'm butchering the pronunciation, where he wrote that people's nature is bad. Their goodness is a matter of deliberate effort. They're born with a fondness for profit. They're born with feelings of hate and dislike in them. Is there a case to be made for this argument that human nature is bad?
Yes. Well, see, that's where I think the hybrid view is better. But that's exactly a good quote from Xunzi. Yeah. So you might just say, let's sort of sit for a minute and do an honest inventory of the kind of dispositions tendencies that we see sort of rise up. And we could start with just infant humans. Like, what do they show in their initial time in the world? Well, infants get frustrated. That's pretty clear.
Yeah.
They get something in the vicinity of angry when mommy doesn't come, or they're very discomforted, right? They clearly experience pain. They want. They also smile to their parents' face. That's great. And they giggle, and they're happy. So right out of the get-go, you'd say for any animal, as we see it come into the world, there's a whole variety of dispositions. Some are more fellow-feeling directed, and some are more selfishly directed. That just looks like the kind of being that we're dealing with. And if we bring in something like Darwin's theory of natural selection and think of the selection of all mammals is going to be such that it arises in an ecology that involves other animals, involves resources that are probably only moderately or scarcely available, and various strategies that will gain for oneself or one's local group the things. So I think one would predict, this is like reverse engineering in robotics, or what you do, or in other places. You just say, what kind of equipment would we need? And what we would need is sort of emotional equipment, cognitive equipment, to be strategic thinkers sometimes, to watch out for ourselves other times, to be concerned about the group at other times. And I think we have all that together. And so then it's the project of the moral community, or the community, the social community, maybe that's a better way to put it, to construct human beings who reliably negotiate the world so that they are successful in themselves and also successful for their fellows, whether that just means their family, their country, their nation state. So this is why I think the mixed bag view is what I call it, of human nature. That's neither we're angels or we're devils. We have dispositions that, attuned correctly, can get us successfully through a life without doing harm to other people. And that's what we should aim for.
It's a fascinating question. What does human nature look like when you remove the clothes of culture? When it applies to emotions, whether it's happiness, sadness, even more complicated emotions like jealousy, contempt, are kids just born with it, or is that something that as a cloth of culture?
Yeah.
And even personality traits, like if I consider myself a creative person, was I born a creative person, or is it because of my relationships or my actions? Okay. So we've explored some of the human nature aspect of it. I also want to explore the clothes, whether of culture or reason or logic.
Yeah.
And I want to introduce Lawrence Kohlberg's Stages of Moral Development, which of course built on John Piaget's work as well.
Yep.
Let's walk through this with the help of another thought experiment. Let's say a woman is on her deathbed and there's only a very rare form of drug that can save her. And there's only one druggist in town that's selling it. And he's selling it at 10 times the cost, right? He bought it for $200. He's selling for $2,000. This woman's husband, Heinz, he begs and borrows from all his friends, but he's only able to get $1,000. Goes up to the druggist and says, "This is all I have, but I need to save my wife. I need this drug." The druggist says, "Nope, I'm selling it for $2,000. So Heinz ends up stealing the drug. Now, how does Lawrence Kohlberg address this moral dilemma through his 6 stages of development?
My general interest in the nature of mind, the human mind, and things like that, and consciousness, it carries over to, and you can see how when you were talking at the beginning, asking me about my upbringing, I was sort of pretty much clear on the fact that I was interested in mind, morals, and the meaning of life. That's the way I put it sometimes, partly just because I realized if there is salvation, it depends on morality, according to the religion I was brought up in. I'm interested in the nature of mind just because I find it quite mysterious how minds work, and then of course meaning. Everybody wants to live a meaningful life, but I didn't know anything about theories of moral development until I was, in the late 70s, I was first exposed to a theory, Lawrence Kohlberg's theory of moral development. And I started to study it. I pretty much do like I always do this. This is my MO. Because sometimes people wonder, why do I leave things behind and then move on to something else? I just do that. Once I finish up a topic for my own satisfaction, I'm very sometimes interested by something that to me is nearby and adjacent. Other people don't always see that it's nearby and adjacent, but to me it's nearby and adjacent. And then I read everything that I can get my hands on about it. So my MO is to really research and study it. So I read all of what at that time were Kohlberg's 2 volumes of papers, and then I eventually got to meet him. But anyway, this is a theory which said all people, possibly in all cultures, although I don't remember if we used to talk that way at that time, but Kohlberg had the view that all people come into the world governed by first nature. Let's use the first nature sort of categories. Basically governed by avoidance of pain and gaining pleasure. So if the little kid does the right thing, toddler does the right thing, in any case, whether it shares the Lego with his sister, that's because it finds it's pleasant or it finds the alternative unpleasant. And that will put you at what Kohlberg calls stages 1 and 2. That's what's called pre-conventional. The child really hasn't learned any rules yet about anything, but is just going with what gives its pleasure and what gives its pain. Now, it's getting feedback from its parents about what the parents like. And so, for example, take the Heinz dilemma. If a child was given the Heinz dilemma, this would be a problem with the Heinz dilemma because it might be hard to give the Heinz dilemma to say a 5 or 6 year old. You give other ones that are like it. Like you say, mommy was going next door. Mommy says, if the cat goes in the tree again, don't you get it? I'll take care of it later on. The cat goes in the tree again. You want to go up and get the cat out of the tree. You're worried it looks like it's going to fall out of the tree. What do you do? Well, children can answer that question a little bit better than the Heinz one. And they'll say, and if a child says something like, well, mommy said I couldn't do it. And then that would mean they're at stage 3 moral development, roughly. That's what's called good boy, good girl development. Okay, and it's the first conventional stage. You just start to learn the do's and don'ts. Usually, this is in the 60s and 70s, of course, are gender specific, maybe. Some of them would be gender specific. Like, you tell your daughter, curtsy when you meet new people. You tell your son to shake their hands. Okay, and that's why they would do those things. In all these cases, the dilemma set up by Kohlberg and his researchers, he was at Harvard School of Education. And many people were wondering, well, can you teach ethics morality like you can teach reading, writing, and arithmetic? And so one thought was, if you could plot out stages of cognitive development, like, learning, you learn the numbers first, then you learn addition and subtraction, and so on and so forth. And then you go on to algebra in 9th grade, and then you go on to trigonometry. So maybe morality is layered like that. You could actually move people up cognitive stages. So if in the Heinz dilemma case, just taking that, so someone might just say the staging of a person had to do with the giving of reasons. So if someone said, well, I would steal it from the pharmacist and give it to the wife because I really enjoy stealing.
Right.
That is going to be a low level of moral development. It might be back to like 1 or 2.
Like self-interest, maybe.
So purely, self-interest. You say, oh, it's fun. I usually enjoy stealing. If a person starts to say something like, well, it's clear that a right to make profit is trumped by a right to life, that would then move a person up to some higher stage. Now, it will always be a little bit unclear, depends on the specification, but that might get you up as high as stage 5. But it might only be stage 4. These stages were plotted, interestingly enough, in terms of when we look back on them philosophically, it looks like what Kohlberg was saying at the time is that forget about the first 2 stages. Those are just, as we say, governed by pleasure and pain. Stage 3, he would sometimes call the bag of virtues model. It was kind of an Aristotelian or Confucian model. You just learn the good boy or good girl sort of behaviors that are assigned. So you say, well, a nice person would do this. A good girl doesn't lie to her mommy and daddy, and so on and so forth. As you approach stage 4, 5, and 6, stage 4 is sometimes described as a social contract theory. And you would say more complicated things, like you might start to talk about the right to life. We've contracted together in a way that the right to life does trump the right to make profit in these kind of cases. So I would steal the drug. Stage 5 is kind of like utilitarianism. It's that you start to use the language of consequentialistically, it's the best, promotes the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest amount of people in the long run, if people reliably put the right to life ahead of the right to profit. At stage 6, it's sort of overtly Kantian. You just have to say things like, use a Kantian language, like you say, the ultimate respect and dignity for persons allows me to develop a maxim, where the maxim would say, when it comes to a conflict between a right to life and the right to property, the right to life trumps, and I can universalize that. So what Kohlberg offered by 1969 to 71 was a model that alleged to have solved the philosophical problem of which is the right ethical theory by saying we could see in cognitive moral development a ranking of theories where virtue theories were not very high up, social contract theories were a little bit better, utilitarianism was a little bit better, and Kantianism was a little bit better than that. But right at the time that I started to study this, the theory was coming undone for a host of different kinds of reasons. And I'm happy to talk about that.
What are the criticisms of it? Carl Gilligan had one of them.
Well, so for example, one of the first ones I knew about, so I was one of the first philosophers I knew about who was sort of reading about Kohlberg. It was kind of interesting. It wasn't sort of on the philosopher's radar. And by that time, I was friends with John Rawls. And then I got to know Kohlberg because I wrote a couple of pieces that appeared in Ethics. And the occasion of my papers was a series of papers that Carol Gilligan, who was a psychologist that worked with Kohlberg, wrote. And she noticed the following problem she noticed something in general, that what Kohlberg was doing was coding ordinary language speech of ordinary people, but very often they were Harvard philosophy. So one of the groups was Harvard philosophy majors. And there's a interesting study of what Kohlberg found was that Harvard philosophy majors, most of whom were studying with John Rawls and things like that, used a certain kind of Kantian language when talking about ethics. And that'll get you scored stage 6. So right out of the gate, you wonder, well, is this just a sort of an audience effect, a certain way of a façon de parler that you learn in certain places to speak a language of respect, dignity for persons, universalizing maxims? It's an unusual way of speaking, and it's quite distinctive in a certain school of thought. It also makes you wonder about what's the relationship between having developed a certain theory by which you answer abstract questions, like the Heinz dilemma, and what you act like. And he wasn't studying actions, people's actions. He was studying the way they speak about moral problems in the abstract, but not how they behave in the world.
Right.
And the other problem that she saw was that women reliably, she thought, spoke not about rights and responsibilities. They spoke more about care and compassion. And that language was automatically going to get you scored lower on the scale. By the time I got into weighing in on the Kohlberg and Gilligan controversies, Kohlberg passed away. He and I met a few times. We had good arguments. He was very protective of his theory. He was very disturbed by any criticism. He had a model, after all. It's still a very powerful model in schools of education, I'm told, in the United States. But I think that criticism and, there's several other internal criticisms, the fact that it looked to be parochial. I asked John Rawls, because Kohlberg does say in some of his work that his theory parallels Rawls's theory of justice. But what's interesting about Rawls is Rawls said he never met Kohlberg to me, even though they worked 100 yards away from each other, which I found interesting. And he hadn't read Rawls's work. And Rawls worked on he thought of himself as a political philosopher. He was defending a kind of Kantian political philosophy. He wasn't opinionated about which moral theory was correct. So that's kind of interesting. A leftover, though, of the, just an interjection, this is just a random thought I'm having, so it's probably not very helpful. But Derek Parfit, in his recent work before he passed away, Parfit would say things like, 3 moral theories are climbing the same mountain. He said social contract theories, utilitarian consequentialist theories, and deontic Kantian theories are all climbing the same mountain, looking for the same view. if that's true, then Kohlberg was trying to like parse things. He was trying to rank those different positions. And I think some people now think they're so close to each other in certain ways. But what's clear, Parfit doesn't have any entry for virtue theory in his book, in the index. And I think what you can see is that virtue theories have now become the dominant way of thinking about child development and morality. And they've, Aristotelian virtue type theories, Confucian virtue theories, Buddhist virtue theories, they've all, as it were, come back as the most plausible accounts of moral socialization and development. And people have sort of left this ranking system behind.
I find this so fascinating. And for the purpose of comparing and contrasting these theories, we worked with an assumption that there is some things are good and some things are bad. But I'm going to now take the nuclear option and even explore whether there is an objective good or an objective bad. So I'm going to explore moral nihilism. Is it possible that there is a mind-independent, real form of objective good and objective bad? Or are these things just fiction, is just subjective opinion?
Yeah, great. I saw the other day there was there were two articles that struck me in the news recently. One was as I was flying back to Abu Dhabi from the East Coast of the United States, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal that cigarette smoking is coming back among young people studying comparative literature and philosophy,
Okay.
rolling their own cigarettes. They said because, vaping is so industrialized and it's sort of what the tobacco companies want, but it doesn't capture the sort of nihilistic nature of the modern world, not to really, sort of roll your own cigarettes like Sartre de Beauvoir did in a French cafe and
Right.
smoke them and get your fingers all nicotined up. Yeah, I've never been a fan of objective value. And what's weird to me is that an awful lot of philosophers who do meta-ethics think about the nature of exactly these terms. Are they objective, good or bad, right or wrong? Are what they call moral realists. It's a surprisingly large group of people. But I see no way to make sense out of moral realism. I think you can get what you want out of moral objectivity or realism by going to basic features of human psychology that are fairly universal, and by basic features of human interaction, which fairly reliably go in a good direction or a bad direction, depending on the recipe you use. I'll explain what I mean. One can have you can gain a kind of objectivity, I guess, for moral, like thou shalt not kill. Let's just take the sort of lowest hanging fruit. Now you might just say, well, why is thou shalt not kill objectively true? And one might say, well, it's because God put it in there at number 6 in the 10 Commandments, if that's where it is. I'm not sure where it is. Now, of course, you have a question that could be raised that goes back to Plato's Euthyphro about, does God saying that it's an objective moral truth make it an objective moral truth, just in virtue of God saying it is? Well, and then you still have that question. And if God detects that it's objectively true because he detects something that would be the equivalent of us learning that Pythagorean theorem is true, that the square of the hypotenuse is equivalent to the square of the other two sides in a right triangle. Now we think that, when we discovered the Pythagorean theorem, many people will say it was always true inside Euclidean geometry, we'd have to say. We just discovered it in 600 BCE. And so you might say the same thing. Some people want to say the same thing about slavery was always wrong, but we just discovered its wrongness in the date. We didn't think it was, depending on where you were in the world, people didn't think it was wrong. But I think what we have to say there is that the it was always wrong isn't like mathematical correctness. It's something like, so go back to the thou shalt not kill. I think it's just obvious that subjectively, Mother Nature wired us so that to seek to be fit, and being alive is a necessary condition of being fit. And everybody pretty much has not only is the organism propelled to behave as if it wants to be alive, it does want to be alive. And so do every other creature around, all other humans. And so I think their Hobbesian kind of view is that, well, I don't usually have positions. I don't usually have dispositions to kill off people. It just doesn't come up that often. But when I do, I have to recognize that they want to survive just like I want to survive. And the world will just go better if we all agree that that's sort of baseline. And so I think it's a matter of wide intersubjective preferences and wide intersubjective agreement. I don't even know if we need the agreement as long as the preferences are widespread enough so that everybody wants to stay alive. Then, by and large, people will think that it's sensible not to allow murder. But I don't think it's an objective. There's nothing in the fabric of the universe that says it's an objective.
There's no metaphysical grounding for an objective.
I don't see that there's a metaphysical grounding for objective values. I just don't see what it could be.
Which feels like an extreme position, right? Because then you could make the case that even someone like Hitler, like, oh, this is just a matter of your opinion if you think what he did was evil, right? Which feels like a very extreme.
Yeah. So I think you can avoid the opinion part by saying something like, this is also deflationary what I'm about to say, but you could just say this, look, it's a little bit like recipes. Moralities are like books of recipes that, let's say you want to make bread. And I say, well, do you want to make leavened or unleavened bread? That'll make a difference. Once you say you want to make bread, I say, okay, here's what we need to do bread. We need ovens that heat up to a certain thing. We need water. We need flour. And maybe we need oil. Maybe we need butter. It depends on it. There are a bunch of different ways to make bread. But there are constraints, a lot of constraints on, which recipes work and which recipes don't work. Now, and I take it that most cultures that are morally serious have constructed inside certain ecologies systems of valuing and then rules, prohibitions, responsibilities, regulations, including obligations and duties, many of which are pretty categorical. You're just never allowed to do such and so if you want to be one of us. And it's conditional. So if you want to be one of us, then you're just going to have to abide these moral principles, which we sort of intersubjectively agreed upon. I mean, you see something like this move I'm making actually in Kant, in the Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysics. A lot of the things that he says are objective, like when Kant says things like, we see the world in Euclidean terms. He says, so the world is objectively Euclidean because there's universal intersubjective agreement that the world, as it were, appears to us in Euclidean ways. Now that is a way to sort of, you check the objective box, but all you really have is intersubjective agreement. That is about as deep as I think you can probably get. And I think the way you deal with the Hitler cases is you just have to say these are just in violation of what are sort of I don't mind saying what Hitler did was objectively heinous and morally bad. I don't mind saying that, but it's in terms of a constellation and a set of values that you chose possibly for very good reasons, though. You see, it isn't that we don't have reasons behind why we have certain values that you shouldn't lie to people, you should be an honest person, you should not kill people. We have reasons for these. If as my colleague David Wong says, if the purpose of morality is interpersonal flourishing, then there'll be a lot of parts of the recipes that you almost always need in there for that to work out well.
If the foundations are interpersonal flourishing and intersubjective agreement, then is there a way to get everyone to align? Because you've studied what ethics and morality means across cultures and also across time. In ancient Rome, gladiators considered murder as a form of attaining glory. Greco-Romans considered slavery was okay if you used prisoners of war. During the French Revolution, public executions and guillotines were forms of entertainment. They were ticketed events, VIP boxes. And you've explored this in your books as well, that across countries, across cultures, there's a very different system of what's considered ethical when it comes to relationships or social norms, politics, entertainment, parenting techniques, or even like treatment of nature. So if intersubjective agreement is what we need to rely on, will there ever be a case where we'll have a universal consensus on what's ethical?
Good. I think the answer to that is, I love the question. I wish I hadn't asked it so clearly. No. So here's some of the things that I found. This is partly. So what I did What I do think, and again, there are so many, there are 192 countries on Earth right now and how many cultures there are in those countries, God knows, many. So do the arithmetic. I mean, even imagine there's only 10 cultures inside each country, just to simplify. That's still 2,000 different traditions with different. What I do tend to find in my own work, I would say, is this. Not every culture that I've examined and I go back, my usual technique for looking, I do two different things. One is I try to get some sense about what the anthropological literature is saying about a certain people now, if I want to study them closely. That's just my go-to. I go to what the anthropologists are writing about. Then I usually go to whatever the old canonical texts are. So I, for example, haven't done any work really on Islam or Arabic culture, but I've nonetheless I tried to study carefully the Quran 4 times now. I'm not close yet to being able to, and I'm reading a lot of anthropology. I haven't written anything about this. I won't do it for a while. I don't do it until I feel like I've got my handle on certain aspects of it. But what I always find is that many cultures, every culture I've ever studied has a theory of virtue. So they usually have a theory about what makes for a good person as seen by the lights of us Confucians. Or what is a good person as seen by us Tibetan Buddhists? Or what seems like a good person is seen by us Pure Land Buddhists? Or what seems like a good person is seen by Roman Catholics in the 21st century? You get the idea.
As seen by people, but not because as seen by God or as seen by some
no.
external.
As judged by basically what the parents are trying to inculcate in their kids, roughly. And then I'll usually look for, are the parents trying to inculcate in their kids the same virtues as, for example, Mencius and Junzi were? Because a lot of people in China nowadays will say they're Confucians still. So I kind of look into what the theories of child rearing are. And in general, what I find in almost all these cases is you'll see that every culture has a set of virtues which you can usually identify in canonical writings as the most important. You can almost rank them. You can often rank them. And if you take the top 10 in every culture, let's just say you could locate the top 10 in every culture, the rankings are not the same, but almost never is something that's a virtue in one tradition considered a vice in another tradition. Let me give some examples. So I think if you ask, I know this for sure, if you ask Buddhists, no matter what Buddhist sect they're from, there are 500 million Buddhists in the world, so that's about 1 in 16 people. It's not nearly the largest. Islam and Christianity are the largest. They'll almost always identify compassion as the single most important virtue. And they'll usually define compassion as wanting to alleviate the suffering of all sentient beings. So they'll have a very contentful notion of what it entails. Whereas if you ask an American what is compassion, they'd give a different kind of definition. But the words get us in the vicinity. So compassion will be number one there. On a liberal American secular list, compassion will appear probably in the top 10, but it won't be at the top. It would be more something like freedom, justice. Justice likely will occur very high up. I wouldn't be surprised if something like, that you want your children to be just and fair. That would probably be the number one. That's what, for example, someone like Jonathan Haidt in his work in moral psychology tends to find, that liberal cultures highly identify justice. It isn't that they think compassion's not important. They think it's sort of second or third or fourth important, but it's not the most important. Another example would be in Confucian culture to this day, you'll have the virtue of what is called usually filial piety. will be mentioned in the top 3 or 4. And it's quite, again, a contentful idea. It's the idea that children have responsibilities of gratitude to their parents that will eventually mean that they will take care of them in old age. And so it's highly contentful. It can even sometimes mean literally the status of the oldest brother is such that the sisters and the other brothers take care obey the older brother and so on and so forth. So it isn't like, but then you go back to the Americans, you say, well, what do Americans think about filial piety? Well, Americans think you should respect your parents, but they don't think you should give them money and take them in. Okay. So
it's not your responsibility later in life.
Not your responsibility later in life. So the good news, I'm trying to relate this very much to your very challenging question about could there be agreement? I think what you will see is that there's a lot of overlap between the virtues people have developed as the recipes to get by in their own cultural context. They sometimes have different aesthetics associated with them, like different coloration, different shapes, sometimes different details. And but there'll be different ranking of which is the most important. That has an effect on what trumps what, like when things happen, when, for example, the demands of justice, do they override compassion or does compassion override justice? There you'll get cultural disagreement. So you don't get universal agreement about almost anything. Now, here's the only possible exception that some people have said is, what about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948? That contains on the order of 20 or 21 statements of universal rights that protect all humans on Earth. It's an interesting question. They're not all of morality, because they don't include things like you should be kind, you should be generous, you should be compassionate. But they tell you allegedly about certain universal agreements. At the time that those were passed, I believe there were about 60 countries in the United Nations, if I'm remembering correctly. There were about 50 votes in favor of it, several abstentions, and several votes against. 2 countries that voted against for sure were Saudi Arabia and South Africa. And some Soviet countries abstained at the time. So it's an interesting question. So notice, that means 1948, you didn't get universal agreement about those human rights. Who knows why? I mean, I don't know why. Someone knows why. Those specific countries didn't agree. However, now all 192 countries of the United Nations are signatories, I believe, to most of that. So there's been some kind of agreement at the political level. But are those agreements about metaphysically deep moral features of the universe? Or are they just the recipe that we decided the world will operate under? I tend to think they're a recipe. The 3 views you might take about something like the Universal Declaration is, some people will say, well, these are natural rights. So what does natural mean? It means they're pre-political, supposedly. You have them independently before there were any nation states. Maybe not temporally, but logically. So that would give them some kind of metaphysical status. They're inherent in people. You have them in virtue of being a person. It's metaphysically peculiar. They're inalienable. They can't be taken away from you. If that just means we're treating them as inalienable, they can't be taken away from you, then I understand what it's saying. But if it means because they're in you, I mean, where are they in you? I don't see where they are in you. That's my naturalistic metaphysics coming out. I just don't see how you can make the case that they are inherent in persons. Actually, if
there's no grounding for that as well.
Yeah, I just don't see the metaphysical.
It's an arbitrary
grounding.
system that you adopted.
Yeah. In other
like
words,
driving on one side of the road.
Something like that. Yeah. I mean, I think, again, there are good reasons to adopt these. I'm not saying that.
You need something.
Yeah, you need something. And these are plausible ones. Some people will say, well, can you imagine in some countries in the world they do things like they say that there are rights of nature, like nature has rights to be protected from degradation by humans. And then they say, how could you ever say nature has anything inherent, like an inherent right? The pushback is, how do you say that about humans? We decided to do it and we do it, but I'm not sure what its metaphysical status is. I'm a skeptic about its metaphysical status.
It was definitely a challenging question. And the good part is I just have to ask the challenging questions. You have the even bigger task of trying to answer them. But I think you're acing them as you have done throughout your life. The bad news for you is that the challenging questions only get more challenging from here on.
Let's go.
Let's bring it on. I want to pivot and talk about anger as well. Like we did for the morality case, we can make 3 different cases for anger. One is that anger is bad or anger is evil. The other is anger is neutral. And the third is anger is good. So I want to start by making a case for, I guess, the most palatable case, which a lot of people might agree with, that anger is bad. Now, this is something the Stoics and the Buddhists would agree with. They had put forward the claim that anger is categorically bad. In fact, when you met the Dalai Lama, when you asked him if I had the chance to kill Hitler with anger, he said, you should kill him because it would stop a bad karmic causal chain, but you should do it with love and compassion, not with anger, which is such an interesting insight into Buddhist philosophy that even someone like Hitler, while you can make a case for killing him, you cannot make a case for doing it with anger. Anger is so categorically bad. So let's start by making that case. Is anger evil?
Good. So let me tell you again how I got interested in these things. It's often my philosophical interests follow on a personal interaction or something, serendipitous that I got involved in. So I was invited to spend time in Dharamsala with half dozen other scientists. They were almost all scientists. Most of them were emotion scientists, which is relevant here. And one of them is Paul Ekman, who's the famous person. He just recently passed away. But Ekman is famous for the basic emotions that are expressed facially by humans. Ekman faces are thought to be the faces. Darwin in 1871 and 72, when he wrote The Expression of Emotions in Humans and Animals, Man and Animals, he suggested that there might be some universal facial expressions. He wouldn't be surprised if there were, because after all, we're mammals, we descended from other animals. It's good to display to avoid conflict. If you're coming for my Legos and I want them, and then I give you the evil eye, and maybe you back off because I'm showing you that I will take action, or you take them from me and I'm sad and I cry. That makes you feel bad, and you don't do it in the future. Okay, so it'd be useful to have such a system. And Paul Ekman was the one who sort of came up with like cross-cultural evidence to a point that the faces for angry, sad, happy, surprised, contempt, and disgust are fairly universal. Anyway, he was there, and I remember after my discussion with the Dalai Lama, in which it became clear that these Buddhists thought that anger was categorically wrong, just like the Stoics. They seem, for different reasons, though. Independently of the Stoics, they thought that anger cannot be tamed properly. It tends to get out of control. So the best thing to do is to, as the Stoics, though, said, extirpate it root and branch. Get rid of it completely from your psychology. And I remember Paul Ekman was so surprised after the first day of meetings. He said, wait, I understand how we could not display anger. We might stuff it or count to 10 or things like that. But these guys seem to think you could really not feel anger in situations that would be normal to feel anger. And I was curious, like Paul was, about this whole idea about, it had to do with my interest in the plasticity of persons, namely, would it be possible actually to get rid of something which I took for granted is just part of my first nature? One of the many emotions that seems to come with this equipment of being a person.
It's one of the seeds.
One of the sprouts.
Yeah.
Exactly. So that led me then to look at the Buddhist arguments for mitigating anger, extirpating anger. And I was also looking at the Stoic arguments, which I had never studied either of these. But at the same time that I was reading about these old arguments, I was starting to do my thinking about, we live in a world right now, maybe I should say this, I haven't really said it yet in this conversation. We live in a world I was taking for granted for a long time, even though I grew up as this sort of parochial, isolated little Irish Catholic boy. I was taking it for granted that things like globalization and multiculturalism were one, that was just the way the world was going to be, that we had both globalization economically and multiculturalism in the sense of just in everywhere we were going to be living, we were going to be with people of all different kinds, we were going to have to learn to be working with them, friends with them, in schools with them, maybe marrying them, loving them, and so on. Lately, we see, though, the backlash to that. We see people talking about, worried about immigration, talking about civilizational collapses if we don't stop mixing everyone. So I was thinking, though, back at this time, that there's so much to learn from other cultures. That was one of my sort of things. I thought, and this was an example because at the same time I was studying the Buddhist and Stoic arguments against anger for it being a bad emotion. They thought it was bad categorically. I don't think it's bad categorically at all. I don't think that personally. But I was also watching the degree of anger in America get worse and worse. I had never lived in angrier times, as I wrote in my book on anger and shame. I'd never lived in angrier times, and I thought, there's some arguments over here by these old guys, and they're still current, by the Buddhists and Stoics, that show us some reasons to be concerned about anger. And some of them are just, sort of relatively easy. One is that anger can poison the soul of the person who has it and it can poison relations. So it's a dangerous emotion that way. One of the things that the Stoics say, even more than the Buddhists, about anger is that Seneca says, anger always gets upset by what's on the outskirts of the case. And that leads to good discussions in class. I'll say, what do you think he means by, what does Seneca mean when he says that? The students pick it up right away. They say, well, if I'm having an argument with you about that you didn't clean the dishes like you said you were going to do, and it gets heated, then I eventually find myself saying something about how stupid your glasses look.
Right, yeah.
Or
not the main issue. It's
always, you get sidetracked onto something else that is just takes you off. And then you don't feel good about yourself for what you said because you didn't solve the problem and you weren't sort of morally coherent. That's one of the things. The other thing is what the Dalai Lama said about Hitler. And I think it's we have so much confidence about, bad people are bad people and we should hate them. Hatred goes with, and what the Dalai Lama said, what the invitation was, and this goes to Shantideva, a great Buddhist writer. The reason you should, you kill Hitler because you're stopping a bad karmic chain, but you should actually not be angry with him or hate him. You should love him and have compassion for him because he is a fellow human being who was born at the unfortunate intersection of a bunch of causal forces. We would now say bad genes, bad environment, bad brain wiring, a whole bunch of terrible things. He's better off dead, but it's sorrowful. And as they will often say inside Buddhism, they say, he could be your mother or your brother or your son or your sister or your daughter. It could be. These are ways of awakening us to kind of a compassion, I think, that is a useful thing to have. So I like these challenges when one moral conception will really come up against what view that we take as for granted and make us think about it. And I think that because the emotions like anger are so wound up with contemporary political practices, but also with everyday life, they can be really useful exercises in thinking about our own, both individual and social flourishing.
I guess you can't even escape the question of free will in this case when you talk about Hitler being a byproduct of his circumstances. Then if he was actually responsible for his actions, maybe you can make a case for anger. But if he's just being, I guess, a consequence of it, then it's much harder,
It's
right?
harder to do. Right.
Okay, you mentioned you've never lived in angrier times, which is an interesting way to lead into the second case I want to make, which is anger is neutral, because you actually grew up in a very angry decade. Your formative years were in the 60s. And in 1968, this came to a head when you were in your sophomore year because the civil rights movement was at its head. Martin Luther King was assassinated. Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. There was the anti-Vietnam War protests, gay rights protests, the first wave of feminism. You have first-hand experience of watching anger being channeled for a cause or being used as an instrument to fight for something. And even beyond this, there's a case to be made for righteous anger. Aristotle made that case. And there's also a case for didactic anger. Parents use anger all the time to scold children as well. So Is it possible to make a strong case for anger is neutral, it's nothing about a tool, it's a stick, and it really depends on the context you use it in?
Clearly, every emotion has a evolutionary function. I mean, it would be implausible that we have the emotions that we have, whatever they are, I mean, including maybe jealousy and envy. If we have those, might be basic emotions, you mentioned those earlier, alongside sadness and fear and anger. They all look like they have evolutionary functions. There's no question that they have that function. So they're positive in that sense, or they can be positive in that sense. So, though you might just say, well, but things that were, evolutionary old equipment isn't optimific. It isn't like perfect for every situation, and we have to sort of decide when we're going to use it. The one thing I would say about the contrast, and this could be just romanticizing one's youth, the one difference I would say between the anger of my college years that was widespread was, I say this in the book, it was a hopeful anger. It was actually it was pretty idealistic. The other day in my comparative ethics class here, I have the students at the beginning of every class, I ask them to bring a piece of music or art from their home country, and that we just listen to it as, anything they want. So like yesterday, a young woman brought in she's from Lebanon. She said there's a lot of theater that takes place in prisons there. It's well known among the people there that there's a lot of good theater. People even go see it, or they do YouTube films of it. But I had brought in a song which I thought was indicative of my youth, was a song called "We Shall Overcome." It's a song that we sang during all those movements. But it was very positive. It was hopeful. It wasn't actually done in an angry way. We were angry about certain things, but there was also a lot of people from Martin Luther King Jr. on down who sort of were trying to help us sort of control the anger, knowing that that could provoke angry responses. So it was actually even then, especially during civil rights movement, a lot of training that people would have before demonstrations about how not to express anger, which is kind of an interesting fact, I guess.
And I guess this is a perfect way to lean into the third case, which is anger can be good, can be virtuous, or if not virtuous, then at least, and this is something Martha Nussbaum also alluded to, it can be a humane reaction, and if you channel it properly, it can be forward-looking and have benefits. So there's a case to be made that anger is good, virtuous.
But I guess I would just say, with all these cases, the anger is good, the anger is bad, the anger is neutral. What it just shows is it's a case for, you have to make an argument case by case about whether or not it's going to be useful and whether it's warranted. Sometimes anger is just obviously self-centered. It's disproportionate. So I just don't think there's any just sort of general fact of the matter. This is why I like Aristotelian theories, because Aristotle would just say, for any emotion or for any virtue or for any vice, one has to be concerned with doing it in the right way at the right time, in the right situation, and so on and so forth. So I think it requires that skill called phronesis. But I think sometimes a cultural temperature can get turned way up. And so I think for now, just to take America's case, a lot of people just think spewing vitriol at anybody who opposes you and saying nasty things to them is a perfectly plausible way of having.
It's
not, and it's just not.
It's not? No.
Yeah, it's just not. It's not helpful. It doesn't get you ahead. It's a poor recipe for success. But I don't have any doubt. What I've just tried to do in my work on anger is just to make the case that there's two kinds of anger. Martha Nussbaum and I agree on this, I think, that I say are particularly problematic. One is an anger that is what she calls payback anger, which is just, you hurt me, I'm going to get you back. I just think that's maybe quite natural. I just don't think it's mature. Another kind of anger, though, I call, it's the kind of anger where I'm unhappy and I just spread my unhappiness by getting angry and pissy at everyone. And that's just a completely unacceptable kind of anger, it seems to me, that we should train people not to activate anymore.
It's become much easier for payback anger as well. Now, maybe it seems like we're living in angrier times because with social media, you have easy access to just spread that anger around, whereas in the past, you had to go get a letter, sit and write it. By then, the anger is already fizzled out. So to wrap up this topic about anger, will we ever have a universal consensus? We touched upon this with happiness. We touched upon this with morality. We have to touch upon this with anger as well. Different cultures deal with anger, view anger very differently. The American way, if a child is throwing a tantrum, the parent gets in an anger match and ultimately the parent wins. Whereas in Japan, the parent will just let it play out because they want to teach the child anger doesn't get you anywhere. And as a result, for Americans, when you ask them, what are you going to do when you're angry? They say, I might punch someone, whereas a Japanese person might say, I'll just leave the room. And similarly, when we're talking about the communal view, Americans would say anger is bad because it gets my blood pressure high, it's bad for my health. Whereas an Asian person might say it might affect my relationships. So with such different views of anger across cultures, is it possible to have a universal agreement on anger as well?
Yeah, again, I think the answer is no. There won't be a universal agreement, and that's just fine. It's an interesting question. I mean, like just like the examples you give. I mean, especially in the personal spheres of life, like the way families raise their children, it just won't be the case, nor is it that important that we reach agreement about these things, because there really may be different recipes that just work well in different ecologies due to the history. It makes it predictable. If like American children or German children know that their mothers will engage them in anger and these episodes are going to play out that way, at least it lends a certain predictability to the way life is. And if the Japanese children know that mom's going to sort of ignore me if I act up, then that adds a certain kind of predictability. There's probably a lot to be said for just doing it in the predictable way that your culture endorses. There might be empirical questions like, which gets the child to behave the best quickly? And the answer, based on some principles of psychology, might well be that the Japanese technique is better because of principles in behavioristic psychology about extinction, that usually if you ignore a behavior, it goes away more quickly than if you punish it. That's the usual view in psychology. So you could say there might be empirical reasons why you should change this behavior or not. By the way, you're making me think. The other day I was talking to my students in global ethics. We read a paper by a really good anthropologist named Richard Schwader called Who Sleeps by Whom? And it's about the fact that in white middle-class families in America, like the one I had children in America 40 years ago, you get the child in a separate room in a crib by themselves as quickly as possible. Child doesn't sleep with you. In most other cultures, children sleep with the parents, sometimes for a long time. Like Japanese culture is another example, long time.
Asian cultures. Yeah.
Asian cultures. And so what he was looking at was all the cultural differences. And again, how normatively confident people are that they're doing it the right way. But then you look at it and there's just so many different ways to do it. In some sense, the kids all turn out okay, right? In some sense of okay. So yeah, sometimes we're just overly confident and very fussy and think that it's a morally serious matter, some things that just aren't morally serious matters. But they can embed very, very specific values. So one of my students brought up something that was very well said by her, which is this. When I read this article about the people sleeping together in rooms, I'm thinking, when do the husband and wife have time for sex? That is and one of the students brought up, she said, well, in families where I come from, we don't think of the parents as like a love unit or a sex unit. It's a procreative unit, but it's part of a wider thing. And that's a different conception, different starting point for thinking about an arrangement, which in some level is just a purely practical arrangement. But it's moralized because it does have significance. And again, if you ask the Americans why they're doing this, the white middle-class Americans will say, we're trying to teach our kids to be independent and we're trying to also have time for ourselves. So these are definitely value judgments behind these. Are they metaphysically objective? Of course not. Again, but they're not crazy, nor is the other way of doing it. So I don't think we should expect at the fine-grained level that we would. I mean, the good news is we're not likely with all these multicultural cities to suddenly be some kind of thin, boring, tasteless gruel where everybody has the same moral habits or socio-moral habits.
The magic of philosophy is that as we explore more and more of these ideas, it just brings up more and more questions and it just gets more and more fascinating. So at some point, I'll have to end the conversation against my own will, but so far you would also agree. I think this has been a great introduction to most of the ideas, and maybe we come back for a part 2 to explore some of these topics in detail. So I'm going to start wrapping up, but before we go into the last 2 questions, I would love to know, what do you think I've built with the Lego? What do you think this is?
Well, that looks to me, from this side, I was thinking it looks like maybe the beginning of an aircraft carrier that's in the Arabian Gulf right now that the United States is sending over, but that probably is unfortunately too much on my mind. But if I turn it other ways, it doesn't look like that. It looks more like that looks like a nice outdoor, beautiful, restaurant, cafe, like on the ocean, on the water. I like that. That's like kind of like, you sit there and you have your drinks and you're looking out of the water. So it has 2 different sides and 2 different meanings to me.
Maybe it's a restaurant that was built after an aircraft carrier. So
maybe something like that.
Maybe the hybrid works in this case.
Yeah, very different from both sides. That's what's fascinating about it, isn't it?
A hybrid between a restaurant and an aircraft carrier. I think it's a work of genius, if you ask me. Last 2 questions for you. What would you like your legacy to be? How do you want to be remembered?
Yeah, wow, that's a tough one. Well, I do think about that probably because I joke to people, they think this is morbid, but I say, I'm in the pre-dead phase of life. We have names like we have childhood, adolescence, young adulthood, elderly, pre-dead. I said, well, I'm in the group. I'm 70. I turned 77 recently, so I'm not. I guess I care most about the things that most people care about, and I've been very fortunate. So I would like to be known as a fortunate person. I had a lot of good luck in my life in terms of being able to develop my interests and talents. And I think that's just not to be taken for granted. I was just very, very lucky to be born into a family at a time when my parents were after the Second World War, which had, and there was, perfectly middle class, but I had wonderful teachers. I had wonderful teachers right from the beginning. I talked to the nuns that taught me. They taught me things that I will never forget. I go to a museum now. The other day, I was in a museum in New York, and I'm thinking, boy, that was in 2nd grade. I saw the postcard to that Van Gogh, I should say. It was Van Gogh. And I thought that was a gift that some art teacher, nun, passed that around our room. Then we all got to look at that, and so I had the luck of tremendous education. I had a wonderful family. I have a wonderful family still, wonderful grown children. And I just feel lucky that I'm someone who was able to really follow my passion. I don't think that I ever felt like any question that I pursued didn't turn out to be really, really interesting. And I always say, I have thought about this question a little bit in the following sense is, one of the nice things about being a philosopher is you can feel as if you at least did no harm. And that's not nothing. I feel like I've loved being a teacher. I've loved writing books, especially, which I prefer to writing articles. And I love talking to people. I love so I've had a life that is for a long time maximally rewarding, getting me to do the things that I love doing. And I made some contributions, and I'm sufficiently aware sometimes of feedback I get that I made some contributions to other people's work. So it's been very satisfying.
I've made some contributions is a monumental understatement to your work, and I would disagree with you. I don't think you're in your pre-dead phase. I think you're in the middle of your life. I wish you have 77 more years because you're a force of nature, and I'd love to see more and more ideas from you. I think the work you do, I wish it continues for a long time. Final question, and this should be very easy for you because you teach a course at NYU called Philosophy 1110, The Meaning of Life. So this should be very easy. What is the meaning of life, Owen Flanagan?
It's like they used to say number 42 or something like that. Yeah. I told my students, I said, I didn't create this course that tells you the answer to the meaning of life. I do think that I should really want to wrap this up here, but I will say one thing that would have been better maybe at the earlier part. I do think that the problem of meaning of life became more of a problem it becomes more of a problem for people who are secular people, and increasingly people in the educated world are increasingly secular. There are more and more people who are not believers in traditional religion, and therefore don't think of themselves as having prospects for an afterlife. So I think that's a special challenge for people who, thinking, gee, I've got exactly one life to live, and maybe it lasts 85 or 90 years, and I'm in good health the whole time. But it doesn't add up to a hill of beans, because then I'm gone forever. I think it was also Woody Allen who once said, the problem with death is that it lasts so long. So there, I think it does help set our eyes on the prize. And I think that here, sometimes thinking about things that we've talked about today, that maybe a kind of frivolous happiness is not the most important thing. That most people, the testimony of the ages is that what gives life meaning usually has to do with developing or having opportunities to develop your talents and interests, that your work can align with your talents and interests, and also being, to oneself, to one's own survey, a good person, and to the survey of other people, to be a reliable, loving partner in communal life. So I think it's actually relatively straightforward. It's pretty Aristotelian. Yeah. So thank you so much.
I love it, Professor. If people wish to connect with you, read up more about you, read your books, what is the best way to find you, connect with your work?
I'm really very bad on social media and stuff like that. So you can always find me either at ojf@duke.edu or ojf2019 at nyu.edu. I'm here in Abu Dhabi for the next couple of years, and look forward to meeting anybody in the region too.
Thank you so much, Professor. It's been an honor and a privilege for me. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
This is no time. If you liked what you just watched or listened to, then please consider supporting this channel by subscribing on YouTube, follow on Spotify, or rate 5 stars on Apple Podcasts. This project is a labor of love, but cannot survive on love alone. I've given myself 1 more year to get it up and running, and if it doesn't make it, then I shut shop. This has been an experiment in seeing whether there's an appetite for conversations like these, 1 or 2 hour discussions about philosophy, about physics, about architecture, about the inner workings of every industry. I know the algorithm doesn't push conversations like these. It prefers maybe 60-second, 45-second, gossipy, clickbaity video, sexy content that will go viral overnight. But I believe in my heart of hearts, that's not what the people want. This is just the algorithm trying to shape the way you consume your content. So if you want to see this project continue, please consider becoming a YouTube member or a Patreon member. You can commit as low as $1 a month. YouTube members get early access to all these videos. You can buy super thanks on individual videos as well. If not through monetary channels, do consider sharing these episodes, because the algorithm is not my best friend. The only way videos like these can reach everyone else or like-minded people is through your shares, your likes and your comments. All forms of engagement, they really go a long way. For other forms of love and support, you can follow this channel on Instagram or Twitter, or follow me personally.